signs in John's Gospel, and this is the fifth sign that we're looking at it. Jesus walking on water in these signs. So we're two more after this week. Jesus walks on water, which is the shortest, really, one that we're looking at. And it comes straight after, in the biblical passage of the feeding of the 5,000. Jesus finishes the feeding of the 5,000. It's packing up. They're not far from the lake shore. As they walk down there, Jesus tells the disciples to get into their boat, and he goes off into the hills to pray. And so let's just remind us of the words of John's Gospel. That evening, Jesus' disciples went down to the lake. They got into a boat and started across to Capernaum. Later that evening, Jesus had still not come to them, and a strong wind was making the water rough. When the disciples had rowed for 3 or 4 miles, they saw Jesus walking on the water. He kept on coming closer to the boat, and they were terrified. But he said, "I am Jesus, don't be afraid." The disciples wanted to take him into the boat, but suddenly the boat reached the shore where they were heading. And that's all John's Gospel says about that. If we compare, these are all 3 Gospels that mention the incident on the lake. Matthew and Mark are slightly longer because they include Peter getting out of the boat, trying to walk on water towards Jesus. You remember that? That's part of the story. So John obviously leaves this part of the story out of his gospel. And there's lots of good reasons why he might have done that. I don't think it was because he didn't like Peter and didn't want to mention him. I don't think it was anything to do with that. It's just that don't forget that John is writing his gospel some perhaps 30 years after Matthew and Mark. And he was writing his gospel around signs that Jesus did in miracles to remind us the purpose of his mission on earth. So it's quite naturally that he's edited his events of Jesus' life to fit his vision of his own account of Jesus' life. And there's nothing wrong with that. And that's quite right these days. We understand the biblical writers, that they are editors in their own right. Although each word of the Gospels and other things they write down is by the inspiration of God, they've used their own vision of directing what they say, because they're writing to different peoples. They're not all writing to the same audience, all sitting in the same theatre, you might say, at the same time. It's different purposes of that. And John's writing his with this theme in mind. So, you know, his is a few words shorter than the others, but if you compare their recollection of the event and what Jesus says, it's pretty accurate. So that's what we need to remember about that. So, because John wants to point that this is a miracle, is a sign of Christ's power over creation. God's power over creation. And that's the important element of this sign. We call it a miracle, but really it's a sign. So let's just recap what's going on here. This is a map of Galilee, and there up on the top right hand corner of that, that's where they've been. And the disciples, this part of the territory of Israel, we might say, is homeland to all the disciples. And remember that Peter and Andrew are fishermen, and so would have had access to their fishing boats. Although they'd given up fishing, I'm sure they had, if they hadn't sold their boats on at this stage, or even if they had, I'm sure there would have been other members of their family they could borrow boats for, and they were using the boat to get backwards and forwards to where Jesus wanted to go. So they're looking at, because the other thing to remember is that through this, that of course this is Passover. When we was looking at the feeding of the multitudes last week, we highlighted that it was Passover. So that also meant it was a full moon. Now don't remember, there was never any street lighting around this place at this time, well, anywhere in the world. So the moon was very important, and full moon, I don't know if you've ever been in a country where there's no street lighting, and the moon and the stars, if they're bright and clear, you can get a good idea of your location and you can walk about. I spent some time early in my life in the British West Indies, in Anguilla, that lovely island got ravished by the latest hurricane. And it was quite amazing that when we had a full moon and the skies were clear, it was lovely and bright. I can remember writing letters to my wife out on the veranda in the cool by moonlight. You know, it's quite romantic at the time. So the moon made a big difference. So it wouldn't have been, and of course as fishermen, they would have been used to fishing in the hours of darkness, but they would have only fished when the moon was up and the skies were clear, so they could see. So there was, as you say, it was the end of the day when they got there, so they were setting off and going to Capernaum. But then, when they got on the lake, this strong wind got up, and with winds too strong, it's dangerous to use sails, so they were rowing. And of course, because of the drift and the storms, they ended up some distance from Capernaum, further down in the lake, on the plain of Gennesaret. So it was a difficult night when they was on this lake, in amongst the storm. And of course, you've got to remember, you think, well, these are fishermen, and you know, they're used to going out on the lake in all weathers to catch their fish and all that. But of course, not all the disciples were fishermen. We mustn't forget that. At least half of them, I think, weren't used to being out in a boat at night, and especially if it's a bit rough. Certainly Peter and Andrew and John would have been okay with it, but the others certainly wouldn't be okay, I'm sure. I think Matthew had never been near the lake in his life till he met Jesus. So, yeah, it was quite disturbing. And this is renowned, Lake Galilee. You think, well, it's not that big. You know, what about these storms? But of course, the other thing that affects the storms on Galilee is it's 1,000 feet, roughly, below sea level. So it's in a big dip. So air pressure, which we know much more about now and what they did then, used to cause these, with the winds and everything, can cause great disturbances on the lake, and it could become considerably rough. And if, of course, once the clouds come over, they lose the moons, they are in the dark. So no compasses at that time. They were pushing on, and I would imagine if they'd been going 3 or 4 hours and knowing that they're not making much headway, one, they was getting a bit exhausted, two, they were getting a bit fearful, and some of them were suffering from anxiety, without a doubt, I would think. So, you know, this was getting pretty terrifying. And why were they on the lake? Well, because Jesus told them to go on the lake. He sent them off. And then, of course, we hear it's about 3 a.m, and Jesus starts to come out of the mist and the darkness and the rough seas, and the scriptures tell us in all that they were terrified. And there is a comment in Matthew and Mark that some thought it was a ghost walking on the water. Well, let's face it, nobody's seen anybody walk on water many times, have they? Apart from these 12 disciples, they're the only people I've ever seen people walk on water. So I think we would be pretty terrified if we was in a small boat and we saw somebody coming walking across the sea to us, weren't we? In the dark, in the cold, and quite not surprisingly. But of course, as they get closer, they realise that it's Jesus and welcome him in. And as he gets in the boat, the storm starts to settle down. And their long journey quickly comes to an end, because it appears, although they thought they was in the middle of the lake, they're now right by the land, and the dawn is coming, the storm subsides, and everything is well again. They're not worried about their stomachs and seasickness and everything else. But here we have this short sign, this short, quick miracle, quite an amazing miracle. So what's the point? Well, chapter 6 is full of hints that John the Apostle wants us to draw comparisons with Jesus' ministry and Moses' ministry, all to do with the Exodus. Now, when we was looking last week at the feeding of the multitudes, I hope you remember that the crowd were beginning to draw allusions that Jesus could be their king. And that's why sort of Jesus wrapped up the meeting and went off up into the hills. Because often we know that the Jews were under oppression, under Roman rule, and a bad Jewish leadership as well, and they longed for the Messiah to come, the Messiah. Often we see in Scripture that when people are looking for a new Messiah, they're looking after a Messiah like King David, a great ruler, a great warrior king, someone who would fight for their freedom and rule like King David did, uniting the whole land of Israel. But strangely enough, here, John the Apostle, on reflecting of this many years afterwards as he writes this, is trying to compare Jesus as a prophet like Moses rather than a king like David. Because we got this whole thing with the feeding of the multitudes, like Moses fed the children of Israel in the desert, didn't he, with the manna and the water. And it goes on after this to talk, Jesus goes on to talk about the bread of heaven. So we've got this part of our understanding of Jesus' ministry and the circumstances that the people at this time, John believes, are seeing Jesus is coming to be a prophet like Moses and lead them out of slavery into freedom through to the promised land. And this is what John's writing in the whole of chapter 6 of his gospel. think of Jesus, the crowds think of Jesus as a Moses type leader rather than a David type leader. In other words, they were still not too dissimilar, aren't they? They're both looking for political liberation, as you like. David would have brought in a new political system, as Moses created a new political system when he led the people out of Egypt. And you've got this sign, if you like, of the parting of the water as well. Jesus was behind them. He came to his disciples on the water as Moses parted the water and led the people out. You've got this picture in your minds, or should have, because that's what John is trying to say, is this is what's happening. This is the sign, if you like. The other thing that connects him with Moses is that as he comes to them on the water, and they all got a bit scared and start shouting out, oh, it's a ghost and all the rest of it, Jesus says words to the effect, it's me, it's all right, don't be afraid. And they recognise his voice. And it's quite strange, isn't it, how we do recognise people's voices, who we know. How many times do you ring somebody up and say, oh, it's me, on the telephone? Because why do you say it's me? Don't we all do it? Because we know and have got confidence that the people we're speaking to will recognise our voice. Eh?
It's true.
It's true. You know, we sometimes don't recognise people. I mean, I had the embarrassing thing the other week when somebody came up and to speak to me, and I thought, I don't know that person, but I know the voice. I can't put a name to it. We all have those embarrassing moments, didn't we? So we throw in a few questions to give us a few more hints. So before we finally say, terribly sorry, I just can't catch who you are. And that's probably because we've caught them out of sequence. In other words, you know, we may have recognised that person if we'd seen them in a situation, in a venue, where we would expect to. And of course, the disciples didn't expect Jesus to come walking to them over the water. They expected to hit dry land and Jesus would have caught up because he would have walked round the lake afterwards. That's what they was expecting. They were not expecting Jesus to come. But actually, when the important part is when you look at the actual words in the text, what we read is me, it's all right, or other phrases such as way. In the actual Greek, the term is I am. Now, where does that term come from? I am. It comes from when Moses met God for the first time. And he says, who are you? And he says, I am. So this is the other connection that John wants us to understand. That this is his point, the sign that he's creator. He's coming as a prophet like Moses. That's what John is saying here, and we need to remember that. If you like, I entitled this the Exodus parable. John has already made it clear that this chapter is to be all about the Exodus, and so when we have this scene of Jesus walking on the water, we should be prepared to understand it as part of the same story, says N.T. Wright. So, John is trying to make it clear that this chapter is all about the Exodus. When we have this scene of Jesus walking on the water, we should be prepared to understand the whole story of chapter 6 as a sign that Jesus is coming more, in John's terms, as a prophet like Moses. not David. So why did Jesus walk on the water? Why do you think he did? Well, to prove that he could. To prove he could do the impossible. I mean, he'd already shown them that when he healed people. He turned water into wine, and he turned 5 loaves and 2 fishes into a meal for a multitude. Why did he have to do it? Well, we don't really know the answer to that, but there must have been something about the compassion of Jesus about that as why he came. He saw and knew and understood that the disciples were getting into a bit of trouble on the lake. Fishermen did lose their lives on Galilee, on that lake. Occasionally. Fishing was a dangerous occupation. Then, as it still is now, with all the safety equipment these modern fishermen have, it's still a dangerous place, isn't it? Because they do fish in all weathers. So is Jesus trying to reiterate that they should put his trust in him because he can overcome the impossible? We already know that in the early parts of the gospel, isn't it, Jesus said that nothing's impossible for God, for those who love him. So these are the reasons why that Jesus walked on water. He wanted them not to be fearful of him. Cease with the fear, perhaps he was saying. Everybody was getting a bit fearful because of what was happening. It must have been quite frightening at the feeding of the multitudes. If we think about it, yes, great for them to distribute the bread. That was wonderful. But when the crowd started getting agitated and wanted to make Jesus king, that was getting a bit overwhelming. I don't know if you've ever been in crowds. I've been in crowds in my days when I was a policeman. You know, and when the crowd turns a bit nasty, it's a frightening place to be. So this is part of what is going on here. But in that sense, Jesus is trying to say as he walks across this water that he is the one who is to come. This miracle is a sign of Christ's power over creation. And what could be a more effective way of showing the disciples this than walking on water? The impossible. Quelling the storm. Walking on water, bringing them safely to the shore. As we look about this story, don't forget, the Jewish people on a whole were not sea lovers. Not many of Jewish people got themselves into the trade of the sea. It was mainly done by the Greeks, the Egyptians, and the Romans. There weren't many Jewish cargo vessel captains, owners. They had a general fear of the sea because in the scriptures there's lots of things that happen when seas roar, isn't it? The raging waves of this world are beneath them. The signs of the ends of the world come out of raging seas in Jewish apocrypha literature. That's what we need to remember. Let's look at some of this scripture. I'll just pull up one verse here, but there are several like this in the Bible that refer to God's place over creation. This is from Psalm 65. You are strong, and your mighty power put the mountains in place. You silence the roaring waves and the noisy shouts of the nations. You silence the roar of the roaring waves and the noisy shouts of the nations. People far away marvel at your fearsome deeds, and all who live under the sun celebrate and sing because of you. You take care of the earth and send rain to help the soil and grow all kinds of crops. There's this element then within Scripture that God, and now Jesus, is got power over creation. And this is what John is trying to portray in this gospel of his. I like, N.T. Wright's a favourite theologian of mine. Here's what he says about this. The story of Jesus walking on water can easily be used as a theme for meditation. There are many times in our lives, and we never know when they will strike, when, metaphorically speaking, suddenly the wind gets up and the sea becomes rough as we struggle to make our way through. Sometimes we are aware of the presence with us, which may initially be more disturbing than comforting. We've already nearly drowning, and now we've got ghosts following us. But if we listen through the roar of the waves and the wind, we may hear the voice that says, "It's me, don't be afraid." And if we are ready then to take Jesus on board, we may find ourselves sooner than we expected at the harbour, where we will be calm and secure once more. How true is that? When we've been in the storms of life, sometimes these storms come unexpectedly, suddenly, and the whole world that we know becomes unstable. And yet this is a lovely story to remind us that if we seek out God, we could hear his voice and hear him say, "It's me, don't be afraid." So a good passage to read, and to remind us that God's not far away. I was very touched. I was out walking Esther last night, and I came across another pastor in Reading that I know well, but haven't seen for some time. And he was out walking his children's dog. He's not a dog person really, but he's looking after his two children's dogs while they were away on holiday. And he was out struggling with these two dogs all over the place. And he caught sight of me in one of the parks. Oh! And he recognised me before I recognised him. And he shouted across and came across with his dogs. And all the rest of it, and my dog, they play for a bit, and what have you. And asked me how I was, so I told him. And he stood there in the park and prayed for me. Now that's a God moment to me. It's not something I normally see, but at this time, this week, what a lovely reminder that God led in my way to give me some encouragement this week. So I'm eternally grateful for that. As if we listen through the roar of the waves and the wind, we may hear the voice that say, "It's me, don't be afraid." So a good one when we're in stormy territory. So next week we're on to the 6th sign, and it's Jesus heals the blind man.